This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome, folks. Here we are one more time at corebrainjournal.com. This is Dr. Charles Parker, and we have as our guest Dr. Peter McCusker, and he is from Philadelphia area, and we're welcoming him. He's going to talk about really healthy activity for life. Peter, welcome. We enjoy having you.
Oh, Chuck, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So Peter and I have been talking offline a little bit, and we have a lot of things in common. But what I'd like to do before we get into our shared Philadelphia experience, Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself personally. I'm getting myself out of sync. Let me give you an intro. I didn't give you an intro. I'm so eager to get into talking with you. Let me go ahead and give you an intro. Peter is also a graduate of Hahnemann University Hospital and Temple University, where I went to Hahnemann. And Dr. McCusker has provided physical medicine and rehab services for over 30 years, my friends. He is a member of the National Register of Health Service Psychologists and a Medicare and medical insurance provider, and a former psychology adjunct professor at four Philadelphia area universities. Dr. McCusker writes a weekly health-oriented blog, and we'll have that in the show notes. It's healthy. Let's see if I can't read it. I wrote Healthful Activity for Life at blogspot.com, and recently published the book, which we're going to discuss in a moment, Don't Rest in Peace, Activity-Oriented, Integrated Physical and Mental Health. Welcome again, Peter. Tell us a little bit about yourself personally, if you will.
Well, I am a Philadelphia kid originally. I grew up in the city. Like so many working class family type kids, I would hang around with my friends and raise a little hell now and then, and wound up quitting school, joining the Marine Corps. I spent some time in Vietnam, and then I spent time in Brunswick, Maine, in a missile base, and then in Rota, Spain, with Polaris subs. I was not a submariner, but the Marines took care of the nuclear weapons in those places.
Mm-hmm. Wow, you've had a tour.
So then while I was in the Marines, I got my GED. I came out, and I had enough sense to go to college. I got my bachelor's degree, I got my master's degree, and I got my doctorate, all in psychology. And I think I had learned at a gut level the importance of self-discipline and the importance of being able to use the strengths and the capabilities that you have in the best way as you can.
Interesting story. Unbelievable. I didn't realize that. I didn't quite get into the military history that you have. You know, we have a whole thing here at Core Brain Journal on vets. We're very interested in vets, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and all that sort of thing. We've got a page dedicated to corebrainjournal.com/vets, because we have interviewed a number of really interesting people who are dealing with that particular subject. So moving on. So let's talk a little bit about what you're currently doing with your life right now, Peter. What's your activity? What are you enmeshed in?
Mostly rehabilitation psychology. I see patients primarily with lifestyle-oriented illnesses like amputations, diabetes, strokes, etc. And what I try to do is to help them develop a more healthful lifestyle, either to mitigate the problems that they already have or to avoid problems further down the road.
Well, you know, Peter, that was a very interesting conversation that we had before we even started talking. I mean, we crossed paths at an Anna Freud lecture in Philadelphia many, many years ago. I didn't know Peter was there. He didn't know I was there. And then he was telling us a number of other issues. Did you actually do psychoanalysis for a while? Were you involved with psychoanalytic training?
I did psychoanalytic psychotherapy, but I never did psychoanalysis. I also did cognitive behavioral therapy way in the very beginning of its creation.
Yeah, they had several people there in Philadelphia who were into it. I remember when Albert Ellis came in to
I
talk.
was just about to say Albert Ellis.
You know, he gave a talk out at Haverford State Hospital when I was there. And his famous line there, of course, I was deeply involved with psychoanalysis at that time. And his famous line was, get this, he says, "You know what I think about the unconscious? F the unconscious."
Imagine.
And
Sounds like
everybody's socks rolled up and down. So did you actually work with Ellis then?
I did not work with him, but I worked with people who did work with him for supervision and so forth.
Interesting guy, though. I mean, he really made his point quite emphatically, and it was an interesting guy and an interesting take on a lot of things, and it was very helpful. So, tell us a little bit about "Don't Rest in Peace." What are you talking about with your book there when you get into that, Peter?
Well, what I'm emphasizing is that healthful lifestyle is critical for so many features of our general well-being. Medicine has been incredibly successful in some areas, such as visual problems and various kinds of surgeries, but the lifestyle problems like diabetes, hypertension, etc., have not been handled very well. And I believe the reason for that is you and I learned a long time ago that behavior is multiply determined. Sometimes we use the expression overdetermined, that there's no one reason why people do the things that they do. Just to take a kind of parochial example, why do you go to work? You go to work because you need to earn money, your job is interesting, you would be bored at home, etc. Similarly, your lifestyle is not determined by one thing, it's by many things. And what we need to do if we want to change our lifestyle is to think about certain key factors like our history, our temperament, our personality, and our environments, meaning the natural world that we live in, the world created by people, the buildings and spaces and so forth, and most important, the interpersonal world, the people that we're around. So if you think about yourself in terms of the history of your behavior, let's say it's your eating behavior, you think about your history, you think about your temperament. Are you an impulsive eater, for instance? You think about your personality. Are you a very anxious person who tends to eat when they're nervous? You think about your interpersonal relationships. Do you live in a home where the cupboard is full of cookies and cakes and so forth? I know myself, I'm a pretty disciplined eater, but I'll tell you what, if I go on a cruise and I see that spread of cookies and cakes, it's pretty hard to resist. And so my point is that you really need to personalize. You really need to think about yourself, about your history, your temperament, your personality, and your environments, and to do what you can to take that understanding and then produce a plan for a healthful lifestyle change.
Peter, I'm so glad to have you on as a guest. I'm telling you, we're just, as I was joking, we're just so much on the same path, because we started talking about, as soon as you are talking the way you're talking, you're bringing up for our listeners something that we cover. And it's the reason to do Core Brain Journal. It's the reason we're here having this conversation, because we're so emphatically on the same point. People are beyond labels. Labels are so reductionistic and ineffective. They don't deal with the issue of context. And as soon as I brought up context with you, you brought up a very interesting reference offline. Share that with our readers, if you will, please.
Well, there was a very famous psychologist named James Deese, D-E-E-S-E, who pioneered the concept in psychology of contextualism. His point, like yours and like mine, was in order for any psychological study, in order for any medical advice to help, you have to put it in the proper context. You know, everybody jokes about psychology that all the experiments are done with undergraduate sophomores. So you do a study with undergraduate sophomores, you get on nightly television, everybody's excited about your research, and you're seduced into going far beyond the context of undergraduate sophomores and saying, oh, well, this would work with the elderly and with the poor and with the rich. And, you know, it's a real temptation and it's a real problem, because when you take the research, when you take the treatment that has been created with one group and try to apply it blindly to everybody, it's not going to work.
And the extrapolation of that point, Peter, as we were sharing, is the current labels that are used with the diagnostic manual, how limited they are. I mean, bipolar, what is it? I mean, and even then, when it's bipolar, it has all these modifications that are based on appearances. It doesn't say anything about context. It doesn't say anything about really unconscious. Of course, I'm not really that interested in the unconscious, but it doesn't say anything about the biology. So
Right.
What you were just talking about a moment ago, the physical world, the world that they're living in, and the interpersonal world, they're all contexts that are absolutely relevant if somebody's going to try to actually provide an intervention.
Absolutely. And, you know, in that book and in my practice, I talk about what I call the essentials for a healthful lifestyle. And there are 6 of those. And one is cognitive behavioral status, meaning the way you think and the way you behave, which includes your emotional functioning, that your thoughts influence your emotions influence your thoughts. And if you try to deal with just one, you're probably not going to be very successful. In addition, there are the interpersonal relationships. You know, the people around you obviously have a profound influence on what you do. And they can either be helpful or they can be interfering with your healthful lifestyle change. So you want to know who to surround yourself with and who to get some distance from when you're trying to make a healthful lifestyle change. And then the third one is physical conditioning. And we all know that if there is any magic pill, it's got to be physical conditioning, you know, to exercise, to get yourself in motion, to stretch. So many benefits that cross over multiple domains of life. And then diet, nutrition, the old you are what you eat notion. And work in the generic sense, meaning not just employment, but is there something that you can do to produce a result that makes you feel good, that allows you to get a boost in your self-esteem and allows you to forget about the problems that are plaguing you, There's a concept in psychology called flow, that you get so deeply into your work that you forget about time, you forget about eating, and that flow is associated with happiness. So work is important. And then the final one, the counterpart of work, is relaxation, recreation. The notion that work enables you to appreciate relaxation, recreation, and vice versa. But all of those areas, all of those 6 areas, they interrelate. And the reason I called the subtitle of the book Integrated was that if you improve in one, you have a real good chance to improve in another. We all know that running can make you feel better emotionally. And it can even help you think more clearly. I've written 3 books, and every book was written in part when I was running and alone and thinking and processing. So those 6 essentials are just that, essential.
Well, and just to amplify a little bit on what Peter was saying and say it just a little bit differently and to emphasize, he did say it, but I'm going to just say it again. These are all contexts. Each one of the specifics that Peter just outlined for our listeners has to do with a certain living context and a perception of what's important in life. So it's not just one thing, like getting a diagnosis and taking a pill, because the diagnosis and the pill, it's helpful. It's not a bad thing. It's just not, it doesn't deal with the complexity of human behavior and is not comprehensive. The issue then is, how do you apply it in your practice? What do you do with an individual that's stuck? How do you actually put all that together in a package with a person?
Well, I'll give you an example of a 50-year-old woman that I worked with who, she was the oldest of 3 daughters, and she was kind of like the therapist for the entire family. Every time someone had a problem, she's the one that they would call. And she would try to solve everyone's problem, which you and I know is a prescription for frustration. It's hard enough to change your own behavior. When you try to change everyone else's, you're going to have some difficulty. So she was referred to me by her physician because she was a heavy woman who was getting heavier. Her blood pressure was increasing. She was working as a cafeteria aide, and she was having a really hard time keeping up with the kids and wasn't very happy in the work that she was doing. So what I did with her was we went through those elements of context that I talked about, her history and her temperament and her personality and her environments, and I helped her see how her current problems, weight, blood pressure, and other physical ailments were influenced by those factors, and how she could begin to get insight that would enable her to make some lifestyle changes. And we started very, very simply. For instance, she drank a lot of coffee, and she literally would put 4 teaspoons of sugar in her coffee.
Yeah.
And so I said to her, I'll call her Mary. I said, Mary, I want you to choose one feature of your eating behavior that you believe you're willing to change. And she started by going from 4 teaspoons of sugar to 2. Mm-hmm. But that was enough. It began to get the ball rolling. She began to see that she could make some changes. And we just went from there to changing her eating behavior in general. She also smoked. So she lived in an apartment. She lived alone. She would get up in the morning, take out her newspaper, get a big cup of coffee with 4 teaspoons full of sugar, take out a cigarette, and just sit there. So what we decided was she would cut back on the sugar, cut back on the coffee, and instead of smoking, she would go downstairs to her girlfriend's apartment and they would walk through the complex together. And so again, we would build from one thing to the next. By the time we were through, she had also changed her job so that she gave up that stressful job in the cafeteria, and she was working at the local library. And she was much happier there. And it was an interpersonal situation that was pleasing to her. She was a very gregarious lady. Mm-hmm. Similarly, we talked about how do you deal with your 2 sisters who want you to solve all these insoluble problems. And so basically what she decided was she would talk to her sisters, and when they started, quote, dumping all their problems on her, she would say, you know, I'm starting to get nervous. I'm starting to feel like I need to change your problems, and I know I can't do that. So why don't we stop our discussion now, and we'll begin again tomorrow. And so both within herself and within her interpersonal milieu, she was beginning to learn that she needed to take care of herself and that she couldn't control other people, and to help them see that also. So she made tremendous progress. And I do that kind of thing with all the patients who are receptive to that. You know, some of the patients that I see have Alzheimer's disease, and so obviously they can't do what this lady could do. But when they're not able to do it, sometimes I'm able to do something analogous with their caregiver.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the approaches that my daughter and I are taking is, so we see these patients on the rehab unit and their loved ones come. Often on the rehab unit, I'm sure you know, the persons tend to be elderly. Their loved ones are mostly middle-aged. They come, they see mom with a stroke, and we say to them, are there things that you can do to decrease the likelihood that you're going to wind up like mom?
Oh, yeah.
And so they have an incentive to make some lifestyle changes that perhaps will be either primary prevention or secondary prevention or tertiary prevention, depending on their problems.
Down the life stream. Now, tell us a little bit. You slipped something in about your daughter. So is she a psychologist as well?
She is. She's a board-certified health psychologist, and she's young, and so she's very ambitious, and she works at 3 different hospitals, and she has a private practice with persons working for her. And
so what's her name, Peter?
Her name is Megan McCusker Moore.
Oh, yeah. Great. So, and then you guys, that's very interesting. You get a chance to practice with your daughter. What fun.
That's wonderful. And I have another daughter who is an attorney and who did a lot of work with persons who are having problems with their children. and now she's getting her master's degree in counseling.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
she's also going to be coming on board and helping us.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. Well, going back to what you just said, I thought it was very interesting because you were talking about other levels of interaction that can be lessons. They're contextual lessons. Here's what happens at the end point. Here's what you can do to prevent it. And here's what, and take it down the road. Excuse me for interrupting. Yeah.
And again, it's a matter of context. I bet your experience has been what mine has been. You do psychotherapy with someone and you try to give them an insight at a particular point in time. And sometimes it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But then a month later or 4 months later, and here's a real example. I was talking with a patient about how he tends to become irritable with people. And he didn't want to hear that at the time. Well, a little bit further down the road, he got a promotion, and it was the job he had always dreamed about. They put him on a trial period with this new job, and they wanted to see, obviously, how he would do. And after, I forget the period, I think it was like maybe 6 weeks or so, they got back to him and said, I'll call him Tom. Tom, you're doing a great job, but there's only one problem. Everybody says you're so hard to deal with that I don't think we can move you up into this other position. And it was that point where he was able to come back to me and say, what you told me is right. And it was that light bulb type moment when what I had said months earlier clicked. Mm-hmm. And that's how it is with lifestyle. You can talk with people about healthful lifestyle change, and then maybe they go to their physician and they get their blood pressure checked and it's sky high, and something they shrugged off earlier, they think, oh man, I really do have a problem with lifestyle. I really have to cut off the salt. I really have to cut down on my calories and lose a little weight. So again, it's context.
Peter, it's the reason we're at Core Brain Journal, why we're so interested in people like yourself coming on as a guest, because you're really talking about data. You're talking about data acquisition and reality. You're not talking about dreams, belief, and fantasy. You're talking about what's actually really going on with the person in real life, and all these contextual comments are dealing with the changes and the interrelationship with different realities.
Absolutely.
In closing, we're winding down time-wise. Please take a moment to tell our listeners about the 4 healthful characteristics. I'm putting you a little on a spot. You probably have them in your head. I don't know if you do. But I think that'd be a great place to wind it up, because I thought that those recommendations and your book would be very helpful for people who wanted to move forward from a stuck place.
Okay, I loosely speaking, I call it ego strength. Now, you and I know that the term ego strength has a very specific connotation in psychoanalysis, but when I say ego strength, I mean those 4 elements: your history, your temperament, and your temperament is kind of the biological aspects of your personality, the intensity of your response, the threshold of your response, etc. The third area is personality. Things like, are you open to experience? Are you extroverted or introverted? And then the final one is what I said about environments. If you're in certain environments, you're more likely to have certain problems. We all know about seasonal affective disorder that influences some people in the wintertime. They get depressed in the wintertime. Well, that's one feature of the natural environment. The second area, the fabricated environment. The spaces where are you living in a crowded situation? Do you have to take the Route 95 every day and bumper to bumper traffic, that kind of thing? Mm-hmm. And then finally, the interpersonal environment. Are the people around you, are they supportive, or do they undermine you, either deliberately or inadvertently? So if you think about those four, history, temperament, personality, and environment, and try to take insights from those four, then you'll be able to affect a healthful lifestyle change 1,000 times better than if you take some prescribed one strategy fits everybody approach.
So well said. Very, very well said. Now I'm going to briefly segue you into one other thing. We've been talking for a while here, but I think the other thing that we talked about, which was so interesting before we hit the record button, was the business of how to stay on track. The way you over time manage yourself. And interestingly, there were four points to that description as well. Would you mind sharing those for our audience?
Staying on track in terms of?
Well, the terms that you were talking about was the rational, where.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was talking about an activity-oriented approach, mm-hmm. and I'm using the term activity in terms of healthful lifestyle in a very specific way. So if you really want to make a healthful lifestyle change, you want to be rational about it. You want to think about, what's the research? What's the best way to approach losing weight, for instance? What does science say? What does your physician say? The second element is that it's organized. If you're going to make a change, you have to think about how are you going to organize this attempt? Times and places, etc. The third is you have to do it comprehensively. And by comprehensively, I mean those rational elements that you've identified. Try to incorporate as many of them as you can reasonably do. And then finally, you need longevity. You need to do it over time. You can't be jumping from one thing to the other. There had been the notion of 21 days of a particular behavior to reach an automaticity of habit. Well, that's a very simplistic notion. Other research said, no, not 21 days, 66 days. and that's another simplistic idea. But, for one person, it might be a certain number of days. For another person, it might be a certain number of months. But certainly, you need to continuously perform these healthful lifestyle behavior changes over time until it becomes so automatic that you really don't have to think so much about it.
Dr. Peter McCusker, thank you so much for those words of wisdom. I mean, you're so on it. You put a lot of thought into this, and it's really a question of just putting the grid up. You've actually given us about 4 grids in the short period of time we've been talking to actually get fixation points on what to do next. And
Actually, my book is a workbook that what I do is I go through all of the explanation, and then in the back of the book, there are workbook pages that go through each aspect of what needs to be done.
That sounds transformational. It sounds so utilitarian.
I hope so.
Just go out and do it. I'm telling you. It sounds great, Peter. Well, listen, I want to express my appreciation. You have had, you just put a really interesting twist on a lot of issues that many of us really need to think about much more carefully, because we get lost in one or two of those adventures and don't really comprehensively look at the whole picture, don't look at the context, and then get off the horse somewhere down the road.
Well, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed connecting with you in more ways than one.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll have you again sometime. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.